Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today we welcome Joshi. He's a family physician and he's the author of the book, Burden of Pain, A Physician's Journey Through the Opioid Epidemic. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Fo.
So we'll get into your book in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure. My journey really began with my first medical practice, which I had opened in 2016 in Munster, Indiana, a suburb you could consider part of the broader Chicagoland area. I was the first primary care practice to implement telepsychiatry into the primary care setting, meaning I was combining behavioral health and primary care back when that was quite stigmatized. Well, the care I was providing for vulnerable patients with chronic pain, substance use dependency, mental health was eventually misconstrued as enabling addictions among high risk patients.
Mm.
And while I was garnering awards from organizations like NPR and the NCQA, I was also attracting attention from the DEA and DOJ. Eventually, I was indicted for prescribing low dose opioids, Norco 7.5, 325 milligrams twice a day, outside the scope of medicine, to an undercover agent who presented with cramp like leg pain. Well, I went through the entire ordeal, and I'll save you the details because you can find it in Burden of Pain. But lo and behold, I'm back practicing medicine in the same area, just a few miles from where I was before, regained my medical license, reinstated in Medicare, and back now to tell my story to help inform patients and physicians that you can care for stigmatized patients and you can have stigmatized conditions and still be considered part of the healthcare system.
So I read a little bit about your story online, and of course, it's found in your book. But for those who just aren't familiar, of course, your book just came out. Just briefly share the story of the indictment and how you came back from that.
Certainly. So what had happened is after the DEA began to look into my practice because they felt that the quality of my patients was not sufficient for the care that I was providing, they basically made the statement that the quality of a physical exam that I performed on an undercover DEA agent was not sufficient to justify the continuation of opioids, even though the patient presented himself as a non-opioid naive patient with chronic pain.
Hmm.
We reviewed his prescription history, we ordered a urine drug screen, we requested imaging studies, but this was before 2022 when the Supreme Court required the criminal intent mandate to prosecute physicians. So effectively back then in 2018, it was the interpretation of a non-clinically trained DEA agent versus my interpretation of clinical care as a physician. And I'm sure you can guess who won. Well, flash forward to sentencing, because I eventually had to plead. There's really no fighting this in the court. So the sentencing, I ended up getting 11 months, 1 week, and 3 days in federal prison, which was a shock because part of why I felt I could have pled guilty was because my attorney and everybody around me was telling me, oh, it's just low dose opioids. They're just trying to make an example out of you. This is the opiate epidemic. Just quickly plead. They can go back to resuming your practice. And, I bought into a lot of that chatter. And when I found I was sentenced to federal prison, it just shocked my mind. And, you know, I fell into a deep depression, as I'm sure you can imagine. And it was there that I wrote the first copy of Burden of Pain all by hand, all 100,000 words of it. And it was in many ways my way to cope with everything that was happening. It was my way to kind of find solace in the sorrow, if you will. And part one of Burden of Pain really details my story from how I built the first primary care practice in Northwest Indiana, as I mentioned, incorporating behavioral health, the accolades we achieved, the ill attention that we garnered from law enforcement, going through my legal proceedings, just a massive propaganda campaign. And I'm sure you saw some of it when you just Google my name, you can still see some of those articles about how I'm apparently prescribing 6,000 opioids, how I'm imitating other physicians, how I'm doing this, how I'm doing that. And it just becomes like a cataclysm of just misinformation. And we saw it during the pandemic in acute time, but at a much longer time horizon, we've seen it for years with the opiate epidemic, just wave after wave of misinformation, personal anecdotes turning into health policies. And I hope that my book helps to destigmatize a lot of those false narratives so that we can now finally say, here's the truth, and here's how we should understand the overdose crisis.
So you spent time in federal prison, and tell me the story since then, how you came back from that, and what's your practice like now?
Yeah, so I came back, I went in front of the medical licensing board. I told them I would like to resume my medical practice. And after a probationary period, they gave me my unrestricted medical license. I had since then petitioned to vacate my conviction on the grounds that there was DEA misconduct. The first part of that investigation led to me being reinstated into Medicare. The second part of that investigation is for them to formally validate or verify that yes, there was misconduct. So the first part was easy to get. The second part's a little harder to get, as I'm sure you can imagine. But once I got reinstated into Medicare, my unrestricted medical license, I basically went back to all my physicians that I had as part of my referral network. And I told them, this is my story. This is what happened to me. I was open, honest, candid. I told them, you can possibly question my clinical decision making as to whether I was right in trusting that undercover DEA agent, but you can't say I was acting like a criminal. I think that's the key factor here, right? When we criminalize clinical decision making that we may not agree with, we transform the conversation into something that it's really not. Because clinical decision making requires a certain degree of uncertainty. You could argue that all of clinical decision making is in the face of some degree of uncertainty, and it's hard to dispute that. But when you take that uncertainty and you criminalize it, what you end up doing is changing the conversation, changing the decision making to where it's less about what's right for the patient and more about protecting yourself as a provider legally. That makes for bad medicine. And when I start to extrapolate these thoughts into words, into conversations, into the book eventually, people started to say, hey, let's give this guy a chance. Let's help him get back up. And, there were hospital systems in the area, there were physicians in the area that were willing to help me, that were willing to help me get back up, allowed me to sublease space. And now I'm practicing in the same area, just a few miles away. I don't prescribe any opioids. I don't prescribe any controlled substances outside of Schedule 2. So my goal is to really focus on traditional primary care with behavioral health, just excluding the element of Schedule 2 medications.
Now, as you replay this story in your mind, is there anything that you would have done differently?
I think the one thing I would have done differently in hindsight is that, and again, this is being completely honest, I probably would have required verification of insurance from the undercover agent before beginning to treat that person as a patient. And I know that sounds quite jaded, particularly in this world where Medicaid plans are changing and a lot of patients have to go 1 or 2 months without insurance before they get into a new Medicaid plan. But what happens is that Medicaid verification is a form of validation in the eyes of law enforcement. So if you have a cash paying patient, let's say that moved from one state to the other and is waiting to get onto that state's Medicaid plan, that patient is automatically triggered as a high risk patient, rightfully or wrongfully, in the eyes of law enforcement. And if you were to provide the same quality of care as a physician, it would be perceived differently. So going forward, and again, and it's unfortunate to say because it is in many ways compromising quality of care, but I would first make sure that the patients have valid insurance before I initiate care. And if they don't, I would honestly tell them this is what had happened to me. I have to now take this precaution.
All right, let's talk about your book, Burden of Pain, A Physician's Journey Through the Opioid Epidemic. So we know why you write it, but I just wanted to start by asking you, why is it so important for you to tell your story?
It's important to tell my story because it's important to destigmatize shame and humiliation in the physician community. I remember reading a statistic that 1 out of every 3 physicians experience some degree of malpractice lawsuit throughout their career. That's an extraordinarily high number, but very few physicians openly talk about it. It's this kind of hidden shame that you just kind of tuck away and you move on with your career. Well, I don't want to do that. My case was extraordinarily extreme compared to what most physicians face. So I feel like because it was so severe, I have a different vantage point, a different perspective. And I want to tell my story because I want people to know what I went through, what I endured, and how I came back. And I'm telling my story because it's part of my legacy, and I believe it makes me a stronger physician. Similarly, I want physicians to look at their own journeys, to look at down points in their career and not tuck it away. but talk about it. That one time where you made a clinical decision and the patient took it the wrong way and ended up becoming a lawsuit, was that fair? Why don't you talk about it? Why don't you discuss the clinical decisions you made and why you made them? And perhaps in the future, that will no longer be a potential lawsuit, but a source of conversation. And I feel that by talking about the down moments in medicine, we destigmatize the shame and humiliation that physicians endure, and we make it more open to talk about clinical decisions, more open to acknowledge points where things would have been different, where things should have been different, and just improve the quality of care overall.
Now, as you were writing this book and getting it ready for publication, was there anyone who told you, hey, maybe this wasn't a good idea? Did your attorneys ever say, maybe you shouldn't share your story? Anyone who told you otherwise?
Yeah, I got that a lot when I was going through the medical licensing process, getting that back up. Everybody said there's going to be some degree of retaliation. I heard a lot about the DEA retaliating against me in some capacity. I think the DEA has done a great deal of harm to the medical community, but I don't think that they are the boogeymen that we make them out to seem. I think that they are trying to do good in their own way. And the more and more I interact with the DEA to work to get this conviction vacated, the more I'm starting to understand that they're a complex organization. All these legal entities, whether a state AG's office, the medical licensing board, they're a complex entity of individuals. And we often simplify them into these behemoth organizations
Hmm.
where we think, don't rattle them, don't do this. I actually feel like by leaning into them and talking to them as individuals, they better understand you and you better understand them. But yeah, from the very beginning, I got a lot of pushback saying, don't rattle any feathers, just lay low, get all your licensing back, and then talk. I felt like that was a bit hypocritical. I felt that I should talk from the jump because what's the point of talking when I'm fully safe, when I'm back up and running? Why not talk when I'm vulnerable? Because that's when I'm at my most honest.
And as you tell your story, give us a spectrum of reaction that you've received.
Two tiers. One from the chronic pain and substance use dependency community was just overt adulation that there's a physician telling a story from a point of vulnerability, talking about just the pain and suffering that I went through in a very vulnerable way is unique for physicians. Most patients see physicians talking from the perspective of a subject matter expert. Very few patients see physicians talk about their vulnerabilities. So I think that honesty really struck with the chronic pain and substance use dependency community, with policy leaders. And one of the things that I'm doing that's quite unique is I'm taking this book and I'm introducing it to judges, to legislators, to politicians, because I don't want this to come across as antagonistic in any way. I want this to be a bridge connecting law enforcement and the clinical community. So among that tier, the tier two, I would say that there's a quiet acceptance, there's a wait and see approach. For example, when I met the lieutenant governor of Indiana and I introduced the book to her, she was very interested in it. She wanted to learn more about it. She wanted to read it. And she connected me with one of her staffers and we're starting to have conversations about implementing some of the ideas from the book. But that overt adulation, like, oh, I love this book, thank you so much. I think that's really coming from that first group of the patient population themselves. And that's natural, right? You have that target demographic, the patients, and then the patients sway the policymakers. So I think that's a very natural trend.
As you were going through this ordeal and there was so much propaganda and misinformation that was written about you, tell me some of the emotions and thoughts in your head that were going through that time.
Yeah, I mean, I lost my self-esteem. I I lost my sense of identity. I couldn't even think straight. There's always this cognitive dissonance where it was like, man, that's a rough article, and that article wasn't so rough. Well, man, this one really got me. I'm not gonna lie that it still kind of affects me. I've kind of built a certain wall where I can compartmentalize some of those emotions, and I've learned to kind of be indifferent. But I would say there was this Pavlovian learned helplessness that when article after article was just coming, and I was just like, oh my God, another one. Jeez, like, I mean, didn't this run its news cycle? And it was really tough. I mean, I was 33 at the time, and my first clinic was opening. I was just so proud of that clinic that I'd opened just a year earlier, and then all this had happened. It was a very powerful set of emotions, and I don't think that I'd be able to talk as openly and candidly as I am now about everything that happened to me if I didn't have just that brutal, brutal, like kind of just like, I don't want to call it torture. I don't want to like misuse that word, but it was just I was kind of just really exposed in ways that most people are not, and it really kind of it hurt, no doubt, but it built a unique kind of strength.
Where did you turn to for support during your lowest moments? Because obviously this isn't something that is being taught in medical school residency, how to deal with all this misinformation that's out there. Where did you turn to for support and advice?
The usual family helped. I want to delve into that a little bit more because it's important to talk about all the times I reached out for help but was turned down, because I think that's an important part of the conversation. There were quite a few physician leaders in the community, and I don't want to name names. I harbor no ill will whatsoever. There were a lot of physician leaders in the community that I had reached out to that did not respond or stated that they were unable to help. And, just a month earlier, I know that they would have been in positions to connect. Members kind of, there were certain family members that looked at me a certain way. Propaganda exist because propaganda works. There is something about the human condition that if you're told something repeatedly, even if you know it's false, you have to at least assume some part is true in some capacity. It's just human nature. And so anybody who's going through a rough time or any tough period in their life, there will be times when you reach out to people, and there will be times when you are turned down. Please do not stop reaching out, and please do not vent on the person who turns you down. Everybody has their own journeys. And if people are not in a position to help you, please do not take that out on that person. So the biggest rock for me was my dad. He was always there for me through and through, big form of support. Some family members who I was very close with, I was no longer as close with, and that really, really hurt. And I say that with a certain gratitude, as odd as that may sound, because I'm just fortunate. Like all the things you go through when interacting with people, good or bad, they're all positive experiences. They may not feel like that, but they're positive experiences. And just find the ones that you can reach out to and disregard the ones that you cannot.
So a good part of your book, of course, is your story. What are some of the other main messages that you want readers to come away with after reading your book?
Yeah, the main aspect I want people to understand is the concept of medical uncertainty and what that means when applied in a legal framework and in a clinical framework. Uncertainty in medicine is inherent, and that we have to understand that when we create laws around clinical behavior, we have to acknowledge that medical uncertainty is germane to how we understand clinical behavior and health policy as a whole. We keep going through these clinical guidelines, whether it's about abortion, opioids, vaping, and it's just almost kind of whack-a-mole process where we think we're solving one thing, and then when something else pops up. I think we need to really understand uncertainty in its true form and how it informs clinical decision making and as a larger level health policy. And I want people to understand through my story the role uncertainty plays in their own clinical decision making.
So you've been through it's a pretty extreme ordeal. It's quite a story. How are you doing now?
Much better. Obviously, I'm at the tail end of things. I'm resuming my clinical practice. Things are much better for me now than they were even just a few months ago. And I'm just maintaining a positive outlook of being grateful and, you know, returning back to my own self, that ambitious individual, goal-oriented, pie in the sky mindset of big dreams, all of that is coming back. And it's just such a blessing to be able to see part of what I felt was lost forever, part of my identity that I felt was lost in this whole ordeal come back to me. And I'm starting to feel whole again, starting to feel like my confident self. And so it's a blessing to be able to go through what I went through, yet emerge from that, because I feel like a lot of physicians are going through tough times in their lives. And as we know, as you had covered so many times, physician suicide is at an all-time high. Physician stress, burnout, we got to support each other. And part of supporting one another is to acknowledge that there will be down periods and recognize that those journeys downward are just as important as those journeys upward.
How's your relationship with the local physician community who knows your story?
Surprisingly good. Surprisingly good. I think I did two things off the jump that really helped. One, I just told my honest story. Obviously, I provided legal documents to whoever wanted to look at them, but I was very transparent and very humble. And what I've noticed is when people go through similar situations as what I went through, maybe not to the extreme, there's a tendency to be jaded
Hmm.
or a kind of, I don't want to use the word arrogant, but I want to say in many ways reactionary to a negative emotion. And when people saw I didn't really have much of that, and I was willing to start at the bottom and work in whatever capacity I was able to work in to get my practice back off the ground, people appreciated that. I mean, what's very funny, and I'll kind of go off on a tangent a little bit, but I think this is important. I met the prosecutor in my criminal case, who has since become a federal judge. And I told him that I'm working to vacate this conviction and that I didn't appreciate the misconduct that took place in my case. He and I had like a 5 minute conversation, a legitimate 5 minute conversation about this. And he has to obviously recuse himself for future proceedings. But he said that he would go through everything and verify the misconduct that took place. And I thought that was really fascinating because in order for the DEA to acknowledge their misconduct, they have to do it in an official capacity. They have to do that. But in order for a federal former prosecutor, now as a judge, to come back and say, yeah, you know what? Let me take a look back and just verify if I really got things right or where these things were wrong or not. It tells a lot about who he was as an individual. And you can say so much about good guys and
Hmm.
bad guys and this and simplify the narrative. But really, I think my story is a complex tale of many individuals who are trying to do what they think are is right in a very difficult problem, and that's the opioid epidemic. And I feel like just the way I present myself and how vulnerable I make myself and how exposed I am allows for multiple perspectives to come in. And I think that allows people to then find bridges where there would have been otherwise battle lines.
And my final question, Jay, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Key take home message is to really understand that medicine is a complex entity and that our tendency to reduce it to simplified narratives for a myriad of issues, opiate epidemic, the pandemic, abortion, is really causing more harm than good. I think we need to look at medicine as the complex, uncertain concept that it is, and to really find solutions that take into account the complexity of medicine, because that's inherent in all policies. And once we find out how complex medicine is, we'll quickly find out what the right solution can be.
Jay, thank you so much for sharing your story time and insight, and thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.